Hi everyone, I'm Chelsea Siegel, and I am presenting this week's case study on how Kristen died. Before we kind of dive into everything, I wanted to provide some details here. The victim was Kristen Lardner, and the perpetrator was Michael Cartier. This murder and suicide case occurred on May 30th, 1992, at around 6 o'clock on the sidewalk, an alleyway outside of where Kristen worked. This incident was somewhat caused by bureaucracy, which was the main subject of this week's module. And then we have some background information of both the victim and the perpetrator. We have Kristen Lardner, who was at a young age of 21, born in Washington, D.C., but lived in Boston. She was college educated and came from a big family, and she was known for having a passion for art and photography. Then we have Michael, who came from an abusive family, where his mom was a teen mom and his dad left at the early age of 2. And then he has a history of where he got in trouble from the age of 7 up until his death. It also shows a long history of violence towards animals and women that he had dated. Then we have events leading up to Kristen's death, where it starts from 1988 up until 1992. In 1988, you could see he was arrested for burglary, and then it continues on with his stalking and his assaults towards his former girlfriends. I thought it was important to include domestic violence in 1992. Just an overview here. An estimated 1,400 women were killed by a husband or boyfriend. Family Violence Protection Board finds that emergency workers are not equipped with skills to recognize signs of domestic violence, so doctors were told to screen them for signs of violence. And then 19 out of 50 states require the arrest of a person who violates an order for protection. So after analyzing this case, here are some of my findings. Both the court psychiatrist and probation officer specializing in violence failed to follow proper protocols. For example, Dr. Mike filed a report stating that Michael had no acute mental disorder or suicidal tendencies. So basically, he failed to review his file that would have shown all this history and would have shown that he had medical care and had been treated from January of 1991 up until April of that year. He also would have seen that he was prescribed medication for depression. Then we have a lack of communication by the justice system, where there's a separation of departments that resulted in poor communication between the officers, mental health, and law enforcement as a whole. With that, I also included organizational theory, where we have, these relationships between organizations and how they interact with one another, which is really important. Information sharing is critical for good decision making, especially in this type of case. Then we have a need for increased responsiveness. For example, the district judge Lawrence Shedbo failed to check Michael's criminal record before implementing a restraining order and other charges against him. Due to Kristen's urgency and danger she was in, more should have been done to assess the reason for that restraining order. Then we have a lack of accountability. The case shows that there was a delay in the documentation being processed for Michael's arrest on assault that was issued with his temporary restraining order. The new law in 1990 provided mandatory arrest for violation of restraining order, and new law on May 18th deemed stalking in fact a crime. So with that, I have some recommendations. One being an increase in communication within the criminal justice system. Obviously, there was poor communication within all the agencies, so perhaps having a bi-monthly meeting be set up between the chief justices of the major courts to discuss issues such as probation monitoring, court-ordered psychiatric counseling, and probate and family court issues. This meeting would allow agency heads to talk with one another about the effectiveness of various programs they have ordered and discuss new techniques they have implemented for monitoring offenders. It would essentially assist in the push for greater cross-agency communication between all the departments as a whole. Then we have implementation of more manpower and separate task forces to identify repeat offenders. So with that, you can hire more employees to bring these types of cases to the attention of people of higher authority more efficiently. I would recommend that agency heads ask their probation departments to create a task force to assemble some type of data for existing offenders. It could consist of a spreadsheet to distribute to probation departments bi-weekly or however they would want to. This would be a more efficient way to assess history when offenders enter the system, and probations have that to reference later on. Going back to that manpower idea, I do want to give an example. In Kristen's case, the first police officer, Sergeant Simmons, filed a complaint for an immediate summons. However, the clerk was unable to type up the summons because his workload was too heavy. There, the judge did not receive the summons in a timely manner to make a decision. Another idea would be a collaboration with nonprofit organizations. Probation department leads can meet with directors of various programs to get some type of professional development. For example, Diane Moeller, I wouldn't say she was equipped to, tell Michael that he should give that advice that Michael should be in a violence program versus getting the mental health that he actually needed. So what has changed with domestic violence? Since this incident, the Violence Against Women Act was established in 1994. It shows that protective orders in one state translate to another, and certain behaviors are a crime and carry a punishment. In year of the Domestic Violence Registry, 50,000 restraining orders were requested. Of those, 77% of the alleged abuser had a prior history, and 75% were on probation. Now we move on to this week's chapter that discusses bureaucracy. So this is the biggest ideas from this week's module. It is discussed in the chapter of Tompkins reading and correlates to the case. Bureaucracy provides necessary administrative functions like conducting exams, issuing permits and license, and collecting fees. In this case, we're mostly discussing the administrative functions. And then here are the features. Then we have factors that affected the structure of the case. The work is divided to ensure duties and decisions being made are within their own bubble. And we have technical expertise, where probation officer recommended education courses versus therapy and mental health advice, going back to what I stated about Diane Moeller. Then we have the lack of written documentation being processed. And then finally, rules and regulations, where criminal records should have been reviewed before filing a restraining order. So ultimately, we want to know how to prevent domestic violence. We want to take action when necessary and never withhold information. It's important, communication is key here. It's important to communicate with the necessary departments to find out more and basically report everything. And for the victim, be aware of your surroundings at all times. So with that, questions and feedback. I want to know what your thoughts are on this case. And a question that I have for you is, do you think Kristen's identity as a woman was partially the cause of her death? Do you believe the overflow of woman reporting makes her story less convincing? Thanks for watching, guys.